Good morning and aloha. All right, I know it's early, but we can do better than that. Aloha. I am thrilled to welcome all of you today to our housing conference discussing the shortage of housing here in Hawaii, which I believe is the most important issue for our community. I want to extend a special welcome to those viewing on Facebook Live, on Olelo, and on YouTube. I also want to acknowledge elected officials who either are here in the audience or are on their way. I know Senator Moriwaki was here a little bit earlier. Before we begin the presentations, I would like to thank our sponsors, without whom today's conference would not have been possible. They include the Hawaii Construction Alliance, the Land Use Research Foundation, and Olelo, which is recording for broadcast on Olelo as well as posting online afterwards. In addition to Adrian Tam, whom you just met, and Ian Terayama from our office, I'd also like to thank our volunteers, Aaron Fernandez, Landon Lee, Dyson Chi, and Michelle Daigle. Today's conference will be different from some of the other affordable housing conferences you may have attended in the past. Our first two presentations will spend some time discussing what's led to the situation we have today, but the bulk of the presentations will be on concrete, tangible ideas to achieve 65,000 housing units by 2025, which is the number that the State Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism has forecast will be our demand for the 10-year period from 2015 to 2025. We're not here just to talk about how bad things are. We're here to talk about concrete solutions. Some of them you'll agree with. You may disagree with others. Some of the presenters today have been on opposite sides of tough political battles in the past. But Hawaii is a small place with many stakeholders: environmentalists, developers, labor unions, community groups, and political leaders, among others. No realistic solution will involve steamrolling any of these groups. Like it or not, we have to live with each other on a small chain of islands. And this conference is a small step for all these diverse interests to find common ground on digging our way out of this crisis. And actually, let me introduce our first presenter this morning. His name is Mr. Dean Uchida. He is currently the president of the Building Industry Association Hawaii, and he's a senior project manager in SSFM's Strategic Services Group and provides real estate advisory and project management services to a wide cross-section of private corporations and public agencies. Prior to SSFM, he was at D.R. Horton Schuler Division and responsible for the Ho'opili development in East Kapolei. He was also executive director of the Land Use Research Foundation of Hawaii, LURF, which is a private, nonprofit research and trade organization whose members are major Hawaii landowners and developers. Prior to that, he was administrator of the Land Division with the State Department of Land and Natural Resources. Mr. Uchida has been involved from both the private and public sectors in real estate development, property management, land use law, and land use planning in Hawaii since 1981. This morning, he will be presenting on how we got into this mess. Please welcome Dean Uchida.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for waking up so early to help us out, solve this housing problem that we're in right now. So my role today is kind of to paint the picture about how we got in the situation we got. How do we get to a point where we're projected to be 65,000 units short over the next 10 years? So I want to kind of, what I'm going to be covering today is our present housing situation, some of the key areas that are preventing us from increasing the supply of housing. And then some suggestions from the building industry about what can be done to help build our way out of this crisis. So as Senator Chang said, DBED had done this study, I think in 2015. And based on just normal population growth, the projection is like almost 65,000 units are going to be short. On Oahu alone, it's 25,000 units. So what we did is we took a look at building permits being issued over the last several years from the City and County of Honolulu. And from 2015, if you wanted to make a dent in the shortage, 25,000 units over 10 years, that's about 2,500 units a year we would need to be producing just to meet normal population. And if you look at the lower numbers, we only about 1,000, maybe 1,100 units over the last couple of years. So not only are we deficient, but we're not even producing enough to keep up with the projected shortfall. And the lack of supply of housing is kind of the reason why our housing prices are so high. I mean, I think it's a 2-year cycle, so September 2016 to August 2018. And the price of housing has hovered in that 750, and I think this past August it hit like 810,000. And I don't know too many young people, at least my kids, can't afford a $800,000 mortgage. Another symptom of the problem has been the monster house issue. The lack of supply is forcing, creating opportunities for people who are trying to build apartment buildings in residential subdivisions, creating all kind of community issues. So why is there a lack of supply of housing in Hawaii? What are some of the reasons why we have this lack of supply? Well, first of all, we have a very involved in land use entitlement system. The state of Hawaii has a 2-tiered process. The state classifies land statewide in one of 4 land use districts, urban, ag, conservation, and rural. And once you go through a reclassification process at the state, then you got to go through a zoning process at the city. So if you take like ag lands and you urbanize it at the land use commission, then you got to go to the county and get it basically zoned residential, apartment, commercial, whatever. And that process takes a long time. So this is kind of a map showing Oahu and the land use districts. You can see Oahu doesn't have any rural, so there's just 3. The kind of red color is urban, the gray area is conservation, and the green area is ag. So statewide, we're looking at approximately 2 million acres being in ag, 2 million in conservation, and about only 5% or 200,000 acres total statewide is urbanized. So less than 5% of the total area of the state is urban. Okay, so what's happened in this process is government has been slow to react. The counties are responsible for planning where growth's going to occur. They create community development plans, sustainable plans, identifying where they want to house people in the future. And that process, once they do it, the Land Use Commission doesn't automatically reclassify the lands. So what happens is instead of the counties going to the LUC to reclassify, they wait until private projects come forward and try and reclassify based on the county's growth projection. So it's kind of a reactive mode they're in. They don't try and be proactive in ensuring that there's enough zone land to support the planned growth for that area. And so what's happening now is, that was when you had like greenfield projects like Ho'opili, Coal Ridge in ag lands. There was areas for growth. The applicants would go to the Land Use Commission, get it reclassified, and then the projects would forward. Now the county, especially City County, Honolulu, they're focusing all density, all future growth along the rail transit corridor. So what's happening, what are we doing now to prepare for that growth? Well, being in that reactive mode, the city wasn't or hasn't been accustomed to basically putting in infrastructure ahead of time. Each project would put in the regional infrastructure improvements on ag land and then build their project. But when you're talking about urban infill, you're going to need to put in, the required sewer capacity, water capacity to support the planned growth at each of the transit stations. These are not greenfield projects. So you're talking about kind of dense urban areas and then trying to put in more sewer, water. You're going to be digging up roads. You cannot do it on a project-by-project basis. There has to be more of a consolidated approach to ensure that you're providing the capacity up front to allow for the density to happen, so you get the ridership on the train. So in the past, the 70s, government used to do that. They used to put in infrastructure. They used to put in schools, roads, sewer, water, and have the land available. And so you had a lot of medium-sized developers, small developers coming in and taking down, sections of the project at a time, building housing. But something happened in the mid-70s. I'm not sure if government wasn't moving fast enough, but that burden of putting in infrastructure shifted over to the private developer. And so government got kind of complacent. They just wait for the developer to come in. Okay, you got to put in all the infrastructure to do your project. That may have worked before, but when you're looking at urban infill projects, it's kind of hard to do. It's kind of hard for one project to put in, 2 miles of sewer to support all the density at the rail station. So that's the problem we face right now in Oahu. We got this 20-mile corridor. I'm not sure if there's been any investment in, regional infrastructure improvement to support the type of growth that we're looking at. But if we don't put in the infrastructure, we're not going to realize all the TOD, the density that's being planned right now. So it's kind of like there's a lot of talk about, more housing, more development, but when you dig down literally underneath, how are we going to do the sewer? How are we going to do the water? Who's doing that? Who's responsible for putting in the infrastructure ahead of time? So how do we build our way out of this? That's kind of the painting the picture today of what's happening. There's a need for government to take a stronger leadership position in, moving forward on regional infrastructure improvements. But they can't do it alone. They need to partner with the private sector. So there's a need for this dialogue. There's a need to communicate about what the priorities are going to be, how we're going to pay for this thing, and how we can line up projects to help, get the density we need to support the growth that we're trying to achieve. So some of the things that we've been talking about over the last several years at the legislature and the county is coming up with different ways of partnering with the private sector. There's different financial models you can use, like tax increment financing, special improvement districts, public-private partnerships, and then trying to monetize the government assets along the rail transit corridor. So there's all these different ways of trying to address the infrastructure and housing needs as we move forward, given the opportunities that are created by the rail transit system. One of the other things we've been talking about is, there's a need to provide more government assistance at the lower end of the housing ladder, that's 60, 80% and below. And so government should be providing more land and money to help with that type of housing project. But that workforce housing group in that 80 to 140, maybe there needs to be some, assistance in getting more of that housing built. Removing some of the exactions, removing some of the restrictions on building for workforce housing. As long as their target is that 80 to 140 AMI, let the private sector build as many units as we can, because that's kind of the sweet spot right now. That's where you have the most demand. That's the policemen, firemen, nurses, teachers kind of housing that we need. The other thing we've been talking about that's kind of controversial, but we wanted to get the counties to be more proactive. And so we said, if the DBED's projections are correct and we need 25,000 units on Oahu, maybe we should set some production goals for the county and tie it to the TAT appropriation that the legislature provides. Something to think about, incentivize the counties to get into a more proactive role than just waiting for projects to come online. So my bottom line is basically it's going to take a lot of cooperation from government, the public, the private sector, as well as the nonprofits to help us build our way out of this housing crisis we're in. No one entity can do it alone. We've got to figure out a way of how we can find common ground and move forward, because this crisis is getting worse. I got a personal interest because I got 2 kids. They're in college, they came home, and they're still at my house. I cannot get them out of my house because they can't afford a house. So I have a personal interest in getting more housing built in Hawaii. Okay, thank you for your time. Have a good rest of the conference, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have right now.
Thank you, Mr. Uchida. Does anyone have any questions? If you have any questions, please line up behind that microphone over there.
Good morning, Dean. Aloha. My name is Jonathan Scheuer. I'm currently the chair of the State Land Use Commission. And so I just had a reaction to one of the points that you were making. If indeed one of the problems that we're facing is a lack of Land Use Commission action to zone land into the urban district, I don't understand why there's over 5,000 acres of land on Oahu already in the urban district that nobody's actively developing.
Is that your question?
That is my comment.
Oh, I'm just talking about the process is long and it takes a lot of money and deep pockets to go through a two-tier process. If the land use commission would reclassify the land once the county rezones or identifies where the growth's gonna be, why can't the land use commission do that?
But if that was the barrier to land being developed for affordable housing, why would you have over 5,000 acres of land on Oahu that's already in the urban district, already through the process, that's not actually actively being developed?
I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Wow, those are real big questions, man. I'm not in a position to answer the first one about senior housing. I think our position at BIA has been we need housing at all price points. We need more housing. Anything that increases the supply of housing would be good. And we're working with some of the nonprofits to provide different type of housing for different segments of the community. With respect to climate change, I think the city is looking at sea level rise as it might impact some of the stations, especially the ones closer to the shoreline, like Iwale, Kapalama. I think they're building into their model some of the potential impacts of sea level rise. We had a housing summit yesterday with BIA, and we had a speaker come in from California who does financing of infrastructure. And he used a couple of, I guess, real world situations, a development in San Francisco that had actually built into their financial model, putting money away over a 40-year period to address sea level rise 40 years from now. So the tools are there to address sea level rise, and we're getting more educated about it as we go along. That San Francisco model is really interesting because they're actually going to raise the elevation of the land they're developing now. And then the money that they're banking is in anticipation of if sea level rise continues, they want to have a pot of money to use to mitigate impacts 40 years from now, which is pretty forward-looking, forward-thinking, you know. But that's kind of all I know about the sea level rise stuff. So. Question?
Yes, hi. It's on, okay. Anyway, I'm speaking as a community member. I'd like to ask a question about the general construction industry's interest in building affordable housing. You know, when you look at affordable housing around town, you know, you see Stanford Car coming up, you see EAH, you see, what's her name? Anyway, Makana coming up to the plate to build this housing. So my question is, I mean, we've got a crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
They build on state land, which, you know, cuts a chunk of the cost off, as you know. They give state and federal credits, which also, you know, pays for the construction and stuff like that. Would the regular, developers, construction industry, you know, if we really build a lot of affordable housing, we're talking 60% AMI and below, 80% AMI and below, for instance, would, in your estimation, the construction industry be interested in, under those conditions, in building affordable housing, the whole project, you know, being affordable kind of thing? That would really help.
Yeah, there's tremendous interest in building affordable with the proper government subsidies, state land, funding. In fact, I think HHFDC, they have more requests for funding for those projects than they have funds available. So there's a tremendous interest in building it if you provide the appropriate subsidies. Building at that 60%, 80% and below, it's tough to make it as an individual project. The economics just don't work. That's why you need some government support. But there's a tremendous interest in doing it because there's so many people that need that type of housing, right? And if you can make the deal pencil with all the different subsidies from government, you got a lot of developers willing to build. The problem is you don't have enough money, you don't have enough land, and so it's pulling all those things together to make the thing work right. Okay, you got a lot more speakers, so you can ask them some questions too. Thank you.